Hello, everyone. Welcome to the QuantUniversity Winter School session. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Anupam Datta, who is the co-founder of Triera and also a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And he's going to be talking about explainability and model risk management. And as you know, this year, we have been having multiple talks on machine learning and AI, and also we had a wonderful talk on quantum machine learning. So we're trying to bring in practitioners and researchers who are working on these cutting edge technologies and kind of aligning them to practitioner needs and basically creating a forum wherein we can bring in all these innovative practices and how we can adopt them as pragmatic tools within the enterprise. And I'm so fortunate to have all the speakers take their time and put together these amazing presentations and share it with the world. And I'm also thankful to you guys who are dialing in from various parts of the world and joining in week after week. So I would like to continue the tradition like we did last time. So if you could take a minute and just type in where you're dialing in from in the chat window, I'd very much appreciate it. Last time we had people from different parts of the world, and I would do a quick check on where people are dialing in from, and I'll just give you like a quick summary of where people are from. So I see Andover, Massachusetts, the United States, UK, California, Short Hills, New Jersey, North Carolina, Illinois, Toronto, cool. Los Angeles, St. Louis, the Czech Republic, nice, welcome. Istanbul, awesome. So Munich, Germany, Nigeria. So we have a very good representation from throughout the world. Do we have anybody from Australia or India or China? So we have Hugh from Boston. I know Hugh very well. He probably lives like a mile away. Cool. So welcome, everyone. So this is an absolute pleasure to have you all. I'm just going to do a couple of quick introductions on using my slides, and then I will share, I will hand over the stage to Anupam. So as you all know, QuantUniversity is an advisory based out of Boston. We have focused on the intersection of data science, machine learning, and quantitative finance. We do a lot of algorithmic auditing and model risk management, consultancy work, and we are also building a platform called the Q Sandbox, which is enabling the whole notion of bringing all these algorithms and data sets and trying it out so that you can kind of focus on proper algorithmic auditing when you do these activities within our enterprise. And we also do a lot of stuff in education. As you all know, we have partnered with Premier, and we have many courses, and we have a huge audience in the context of learning machine learning and practicing that in the financial services industry. In addition to that, we are putting together some new and contextual programs, which I'll briefly tell you about in a bit. And the Winter School has been an effort to kind of engage the community and democratize education. So we have been working with practitioners and researchers from throughout the world and looking at the amazing research they've been doing and bringing those in these forums so that they can share their research, and also you as practitioners and researchers can kind of learn from them, then continue and enhance the research you're doing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anupam. Anup and I were introduced by Agus, who has also presented at the forum a couple of times last year from August from Wells Fargo. When I kind of talked to Anupam and looked at his work, I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to learn about his work and also to know more about the cool projects he's working on, especially at Triera. And Anupam is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and the co-founder of Triera. And he's passionate about enabling responsible adoption of artificial intelligence. And he has led groundbreaking research in the areas of AI explainability and governance, as well as privacy and data protection. Anupam obtained a PhD and master's degrees from Stanford University and a BTech from Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, all in computer science. Welcome, Anupam. I'm going to make you the presenter and share this, and you can share your screen.
Thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak.
So give me 1 second. I'll see if Has it been activated?
Not yet.
Let me see. Okay, I'll make you the host, so you'll be able to present now.
Great. Thank you very much. So this talk is about machine learning or AI explainability and its connections to model risk management. Kind of the observation and the central thesis is that they are very closely related, that they are tied at the hip. And that's the thesis that I will provide some support for in this talk. It's based on joint work over the course of 7-8 years now with various colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University and also at Triera. Let me start with this observation that machine learning is different in some fundamental ways from traditional risk models, which have been the object of study by model risk management teams for a very long time. And just to make the discussion concrete, if you think about an image classification task, and let's say this deep neural network model is trying to examine these images and classify them as convertibles or sports cars, then in this process, it's automatically learning complex patterns correlated to the labels. For example, it might learn the pattern that the roof pixels are strongly correlated with the label sports car. And that relationship then gets embodied into the model. And when new data, unlabeled data, is processed by the model, then it'll go on to apply that pattern or set of patterns that it has learned to conclude that the top image, for example, is that of a convertible, whereas the bottom one is that of a sports car. Now, in this process, there are a couple of challenges. One is that the patterns are much more complex than those that are learned by traditional linear models. So you'll have nonlinear relationships, you'll have feature interactions, and it's not just limited to deep neural networks. These also surface in statistical machine learning models like tree ensemble models, gradient boosted models, and random forest models, and so forth, which are heavily used in financial services. So that's one point. The other is that exactly what patterns are being learned that are impacting model decisions and predictions is non-trivial to surface. And yet that plays a big role. That kind of insight and visibility into the inner workings can be quite valuable in assessing model risk. So that was just an image example, but if you think of credit decisioning as a different example, the structure is very similar. Imagine a tree model, and it has started learning patterns like individuals with certain thresholds of savings balance are going to be good credit. And then when you go on to apply that to new data, new unlabeled data, similarly, the top applicant here was classified as bad credit because the savings balance threshold was not met, whereas the bottom one here is classified as good credit. The challenge is how to surface the kinds of relationships and patterns that these models have learned in a way that this kind of information can be visible for the purpose of meeting requirements for explanations, as well as to support model risk functions. So those are, that's kind of a good starting point for our conversation today around where some of the key new challenges are that are raised as model risk management teams start validating and examining more complex machine learning models. And there are going to be two parts to the presentation. I'll start off with some foundational work and explanations for model predictions and decisions, which are required under regulatory regimes like generating adverse action notices, reason codes, and action codes. But beyond the regulatory requirement, it's also valuable to have that kind of capability to build trust in models and to support model risk management functions, the kinds of requirements that are, for example, embodied in SR 11.7 and fair lending related topics. And in that process, we'll look at questions around stability and robustness of models, their conceptual soundness, their fairness. And in that process, look at how capabilities for assessing model risk can build on foundational tools from explainability. So that's going to be the flow of the discussion today. Let me start off with the discussion on adverse action notices for machine learning models. And in this, we are trying to answer a couple of different questions. The question around reason codes is, why does the model predict that Jane will default? And if someone's denied, for example, credit when they apply, we want to be able to provide them with reasons for the principal reasons for the denial. This will leverage some technology on feature importance for machine learning models, some of which we have created, and there's a lot of neighboring work in the literature, and I'll provide a bit of a survey of some of the important pieces of work there. There is a related question on action codes, which is not just answering the question of why someone was denied credit, but what can she do to get a different outcome, which requires finding sets of actionable recourse strategies that customers can take to improve their outcomes, and in that context, doing so in a way that does not violate privacy. The action code question is also an interesting one. This is also a topic on which we have done some work and a bunch of interesting results from the community. I will not have much time to go into it today. That'll be a good topic for a subsequent conversation. As we talk about these kinds of reason codes or explanations, one high-level topic that I'll spend a bit of time on, and there are some important takeaways there, is how do we think about the accuracy of these explanations? How can we quantify them? And what does it even mean for an explanation to be accurate? So let's dive in. Here is Jane. She applied for credit. She was denied. And we want to be able to explain why that happened, identify the principal reasons. And as many of you know, there is a technology, a set of results around generating input feature importances. And an explanation would take the shape of what you see here on the slide. It shows how much each feature contributed to the model's assessment of risk or the model's classification decision. In this case, features like annual income and the term duration and the installment of the loan, these were the features that were pushing the risk score up. And you can see how much the risk score went up is quantified by these numbers. And down here are the features on this side of the features like loan amount and debt to income ratio and home ownership that was reducing the risk assessment from the model, again quantified with these feature importance numbers. Now, from once you have this kind of detailed information, you can go on from there to generate reason codes. For example, if you surface the top 4 features here, which explain a big chunk of why someone was denied credit, that could be one way. You could group features into groups and then report based on feature groups, especially when there are correlated features. For example, time series features capturing a person's debt to income ratio, let's say over the last 3 months, the last 6 months, and so forth. So that's the object, that's the explanation object in this case. And what I'll spend the next few minutes on is discussing some of the work in the area on how to generate these input feature importances and what some of the properties are that you may want out of them, what makes for a good explanation, what makes an explanation accurate. So there's a body of work in this area. I'm not going to be exhaustive, but I'll touch on a few important results here. One is the work by Leo Breiman on permutation importance. This was 2 decades ago now. And Breiman's original motivation for it was not to explain so much, but rather to support feature selection. but permutation importance has since been adapted to generate feature importances as well. In 2016, working with two of my students and postdocs at CMU, Fredrikson and Zick, we wrote this paper on quantitative input influence that introduced how to generate feature importances, leveraging ideas from causality and cooperative game theory, like the use of Shapley values, which has now become popular, and we are headed in some ways towards consensus as a meaningful way of explaining model predictions. Around the same time, a couple of months later, there was a paper from the University of Washington on local interpretable model agnostic explanations, or LIME, which has also gotten a fair bit of attention. Sure, many of you here are familiar with it. And later in 2017, there was work from a different team at the University of Washington on Shapley additive explanations, which is a neighbor of our work, but also differs from it in fundamental ways that I'll get into as we go along. In that same vein, but transitioning from discontinuous models like gradient boosted models and random forest models to more continuous differentiable models like deep neural networks, there's an interesting piece of work from a team at Google Research, integrated gradients, that is actually a very close cousin of our work with quantitative input influence, but a natural adaptation of it to the setting of deep neural networks. So what I will get into in the next few minutes is a common denominator across all of these methods. So while they might seem like very different methods, underlying them, there are some foundational principles that are similar. And then certain instances of those steps that I'll walk you through are different in ways that have significant implications as well. So you can think of the way these feature importances are generated as a three-step process. The first step is a query definition, where you're laying out what question about the model's prediction or decision you're trying to explain. You might be interested in questions like local questions, like why does a specific individual like Jane have a score of 665? Or why did the model deny Jane credit, which is a classification question as opposed to a regression question. Or you might be interested in more aggregate model properties like disparate impact, meaning why does the model, for example, approve women at a much lower rate than men? So having flexibility and generality in the set of queries that an explanation method is able to support is valuable. And that's one dimension in which you'll see some differences across methods. Once you've laid out the query, the next step is to perform a form of causal testing, where on the one hand, we have Jane here, and the model gave her a score of 665. And to assess which features are the most important, the methods will typically create a bunch of near clones of Jane who differ from her in carefully controlled ways. Run those clones through the model, see what scores are generated from them, and then do a form of summarization that will bring out of all the features that went in to the model, which ones were the most important in giving Jane a score of 665. A very simple case of this causal testing is what's done in permutation importance, where let's say you're trying to figure out how important income is. Then in creating the near clones of Jane, you would keep all the other features fixed, just vary income. And this could be done, for example, by just sampling from the marginal distribution of income. And now you get a whole bunch of near clones, you run them to the model. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of explaining a linear regression model, because there aren't feature interactions in such a model. But as you start getting into tree ensemble models or deep networks, where permutation importance falls short, is that these more complex models will have richer feature interactions, and that will get missed in this form of generating explanations. On the other hand, in some of the work that we do with quantitative input influence, or in the Shapley value work with from the University of Washington team, these near clones will be generated using subsets of features by intervening on subsets of features, so that you can look at so that you'll see the effect of feature interactions in the model outputs. So this causal testing idea is an extremely key step in this process. And that's what helps tease out which of a number of different correlated features helps in determining the model's predictions. The final step is a summarization step, where you want to take all of this information here through this causal testing or differential analysis, and then summarize it, distill it down to one number for each feature that then goes on to say that, well, Jane got a score of 665, and out of that, 133 is accounted for by debt to income ratio, minus 45 by income, and so forth. There's lots of different ways in which you could do the summarization. And this is, again, a place where some amount of consensus is now building around the use of Shapley values for accurately summarizing the contributions of different features. And then there's a near neighbor of Shapley value called Aumann-Shapley values, which is the basis for integrated gradients and other work, including our work on influence-directed explanations, which builds on it. Now, I'll give you a bit more intuition as we go along on the key ideas behind Shapley and Aumann-Shapley values and some rationale for why that form of summarization makes sense. Leino, for example, does its summarization in a different way. Instead of using Shapley or Aumann-Shapley values, what Leino will do is, after it has done this causal testing, it fits a local linear model in the neighborhood of Jane, in a way that the local linear model agrees with the more complex machine learning model in its predictions. And then you can think of the Leino model as a surrogate or alternative model, which agrees with the original model in its predictions. What it, however, is not guaranteed to do is that the reasons for the predictions in the two models might still be quite different, because there might be correlated features that get picked up differently by the surrogate model than it is by the more complex ML model. So if income and debt to income ratio, for example, are strongly correlated, let's say the complex model uses income a lot more, the surrogate model might be able to arrive at the same prediction by using debt to income ratio more than income. And so the feature importances you will get out of these two models may not agree, even if the predictions agree. So there's a whole set of principles here that for generating good reason codes. Flexible queries is one thing we touched on. Causal influence is important. Separating out which of two or more correlated features drive the model's prediction. There are some questions around analytical soundness, which I'll turn to in a little bit. And that's also a justification for why the summarization, when you use a certain kind of summarization method like Shapley values, what is its rationale? It's also valuable to be able to preserve correlations across features that you may want to look at collectively as a feature group. And finally, of course, for pragmatic use, efficiency is an important consideration and raises a whole bunch of algorithmic and technical challenges. So let me make a few comments here quickly to highlight some of the nuances and complexities that's hidden one layer under what we have discussed so far. So when we talk about query definitions, what question you're trying to answer, let's just work with the credit example to keep things simple. Here is Jane, and she was denied credit. if you're answering the question of why was Jane denied credit, that by itself is not a complete question. Implicit in that is a comparison group. Why was Jane denied credit relative to some comparison group? If you're comparing her to only the people who were approved, you might get some set of reasons. If you change it and compare Jane to the set of everyone who applied, you might get a different set of important features and principal reasons for denials. So it's important when reason codes are being generated to be specific about what comparison group Jane is being compared to. And this has come up in a number of benchmarking studies we have done, and other people have also started looking at this question carefully. There are some candidate comparison groups that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act talks about. But at a technical level, it's important to understand that the question of why was someone denied credit is underspecified. It requires that elaboration of why was someone denied credit relative to a set of people who are approved, or relative to a set of people who are processed, or even relative to one other person. Like in the Apple Card example, the question was, why was this particular individual getting a lower credit limit than her spouse? That's an example of a relative comparison group question with a comparison group just as one individual in it. Another high-level point here, which I'll highlight, is the concept of the power of a state. And the important thing here to highlight is that the reason codes, or what the most important features are, depends on the model output type that you're trying to explain. So if you think about the US presidential election, the features are like the states, and it's really a linear classifier where each state brings in some number of electoral college votes. And if the sum of those votes are above a certain threshold, then one candidate wins. So if you're trying to answer the question of which states contribute the most to the total electoral college vote count, that's a regression problem. It's a bit like explaining the log odds score coming out of a tree model. And in this case, the answer to that question of which states are the most important or which features are the most important are going to be states like California and Texas. But if you're trying to answer a different question, the classification question, which gets into which states decide the winner, then the answer is very different. It's then these green states like Pennsylvania, for example, which often ends up being much more powerful in deciding the outcome of the election. And it was this concept of power that is captured by Shapley value that was originally motivated by problems like this in voting and revenue sharing. So going back to that query definition part of our top level view, it's important to note that depending on which question you're trying to answer, just like in the comparison group example, there has to be specificity about the comparison group. It's important to be specific about which question you're answering. And if you're trying to answer the classification question, then methods that are well suited to answer the regression questions might not generalize well. And that's something that we have also seen with methods like TreeShap, which are well designed and are intended to work well with explaining log odds scores. But if you try to adapt them and use them to explain probability outcomes or classification outcomes, the results of the most important features, the Shapley estimations, can be inaccurate. So I'll stop this section of the conversation here with some takeaways and then transition into a discussion of model risk related questions and how that ties into the explainability foundation that we just discussed. So here are the takeaways I'll leave you with. The Shapley value-based methods can be the basis for meaningful reason codes because it captures the notion of the power of a feature while accounting for feature interactions. Reason codes can vary significantly based on which comparison group is chosen. The Apple Card example is a good one. Explanations can vary based on model output type. This is exactly what we went through now with the Pennsylvania versus California example. And something to keep in mind that often, while first and second line teams will often work with risk scores, there's a need here to work with credit strategy teams who determine thresholds to accurately explain credit denials, which are classification outcomes. The top principal reasons might be quite different based on whether you're trying to explain why someone was denied credit, a classification outcome, or why someone got a risk score of a certain level, which is this regression problem. Explanation should account for statistical relationships across features. So it's important to support feature groups when you're trying to preserve statistical relationship across features. And then the accuracy of the estimation of explanations for Shapley values is also extremely critical, and you have to pay attention to what you're trying to explain. Is it risk scores versus probabilities versus classification outcomes? And that has some implications for which method is best suited to answer that question. With that, let me transition into a discussion from leveraging this explainability foundation. And there's a lot more here than I have covered. How can we address questions of model risk? And as we look at model risk areas, and let's just stick to SR 11.7 just to be concrete, although these concepts appear in many other model risk management frameworks as well across the world. There are questions of accuracy of models, their stability and robustness, their conceptual soundness, ways of identifying errors and limitations of models, outcome analysis, meaning can we understand why models are, can we first of all study how models are, if you have two models, what's the difference in their performance, predictive performance, and go one layer deeper and understand why those performances are different. Reliability of model predictions, where you want to be able to account for the uncertainty or confidence of the model in its predictions. And then fairness and bias related questions, which in the US at least are kept somewhat separate from model risk, and it's more with the fair lending side of banks. But at a both technical and overall organizational level, there are strong connections between this topic and the more traditional model risk topics. So let me start with fairness. One kind of key question here is group disparity. If one group, a protected group, let's say women, are getting significantly worse outcomes than men, can we measure that? And measuring that is just the first step. That by itself means unfair bias, but it does raise the question of what's causing the disparity. That's where the concept of proxy use comes in, where we want to be able to go from the disparity to attributing it to specific features or sets of features and their combinations that are responsible or that are causing the disparity. At that point, you would want to make a human judgment on whether the use of those proxy features are justifiable. And if they're not, then go on from there to mitigate the problem through interventions, adjustments to the model. So let me just walk through a concrete example of how this process might look and what some of the technical underpinnings of it are. In this example, we are seeing model score distributions here. On the x-axis, higher scores are better. Women are in green, men are in purple. And you can see visually that consistently men are getting better outcomes better scores than women, and also better outcomes if you set a threshold around 0. And you can quantify that and say, in this case, this particular example, women are being accepted at 40% of the rate at which men are being accepted. When that happens, the next question is why? What's causing that disparity? So you can go on from there to attribute it to specific features that are causing the disparity. And And this, you can think of this at a technical level as a generalization of what we were seeing before for individual predictions. So previously, we were looking at a specific individual chain and asking, oh, why was Jane denied credit? Now we have lifted that question up to a distribution level. And we are asking, why is this group getting consistently poorer outcomes than this other group? That aggregate level or distribution level attribution question is a very natural generalization of the individual level attribution. And the answer to that is, in this particular example, the marital status is a big driver of the disparity. And that's just the first step. You can go down one layer deeper to see exactly how marital status is causing the disparity. In this particular case, it was because of imbalance in the training data. There was a higher proportion of married men than women in the training data, and married people were more creditworthy according to the associations in the training data. So the model had picked up on that relationship and was using it, and that was causing the disparity in the model's outcomes. While in the US, this example would not make sense because marital status would not be explicitly used as a feature. It is used in other parts of the world. And the point isn't so much the example, but to show the process here of assessing a model for fairness, where you go from a high-level measurement of disparity at a group level down to a root cause analysis that traces it in disparity. Once you have that kind of information, then you can make a judgment on whether this use is justifiable or not. One might conclude that it's not, based on very different number of different arguments, but one could be that this imbalance in the training data is a sample selection bias. It's not representative of the population to which the model will be applied, where the proportion of married men and women is going to be approximately the same. And therefore, one kind of intervention here or mitigation here could be to rebalance the training data on that feature, retrain the model, and you end up with a model where the disparity goes down, the accuracy goes down, remains largely the same. So this is not the only mitigation process. There are a number of different ways. There's a rich literature on addressing fairness concerns. But what's distinctive about this point of view is showing back to explainability, where issues of disparity can be root cause to specific parts of models, specific parts of training data, which then leads to actionable interventions that can address the disparity if it's unjustified. Let me move on to stability and show you one other aspect where model risk teams, one other problem that model risk teams often grapple with. And this has to do with drift in data. So this is an example where just to show visually, in black is the data from September, in gray is the data from November. And at the data level, there is a drift. These two distributions are not the same. And measuring data drift is very standard. People have been doing that for a long time. But as you start building these models with high dimensional data, lots of features, hundreds of features, sometimes even thousands of features, then there is the curse of dimensionality. If you're just measuring data drift, then there will always be some data drift. And yet, it may not impact the model. So the more important question here is there just data drift, which of course we should be checking, but rather, how is the model actually transforming that drift in the data? Meaning, it could very well be that while there was some amount of drift in the data, the drift happened on some important features because of which the model now sees the world very differently. And because this is very different from the model, from the data on which the model was trained, its performance might start degrading. On the other hand, it could be that while there is some amount of drift in the data, over here, all of this drift is along dimensions that don't really matter too much from the model's point of view. So the September and November data actually looks very similar. If that's the case, the model will be quite stable. The model score distributions will be similar, and the reasons for the score distributions remaining similar will also remain similar. So that's the additional or consequential data drift piece, that where being able to have that additional visibility explain how the model is making its predictions and generalizing it to the distribution level ends up being quite valuable. So when we start getting into assessing stability of machine learning models, both before they move into production and on an ongoing basis, once they are in production, then this question of how do we measure model drift, how do we attribute drift back to features that are causing the drift, and this is at a technical level similar to the question of fairness assessments that I just covered, where we are lifting the framework of individual explanations to distribution level attribution. And this is something we have found as we have worked with a number of different financial services companies now. We are finding the stability assessment to be a central problem for both for model risk teams and also for the first line teams on an ongoing basis through monitoring. And while there are established frameworks for doing it for traditional risk models, where measures like population stability index and characteristic stability index are applied in a very, very nice way, the generalizations of these to the setting of machine learning is a non-trivial activity, and that's something that we have made progress on. So just to kind of close out the loop here and keeping a bit of an eye on the time, the analysis for stability, this is something now we have done at several financial services companies, goes on to measure the shift in the model score distributions and then attribute it back to individual features that are causing the shift. And then that information then becomes quite valuable in assessing whether a model is fit for purpose or if it's behaving now in a way that doesn't agree with domain expertise and intuition and therefore requires adjustments. And there are metrics here that are natural analogs of the characteristic stability index and population stability index for machine learning models. The final topic I'll touch on are these conceptual soundness related questions of how sensitivity plots might have to be generalized to go beyond what a partial dependence plot captures. And this is an example of a sensitivity plot where on the x-axis, each point is a point from the training data. On the x-axis, debt to income ratio increases. On the y-axis, the contribution to the model's output, the model's risk increases. Now you can see visually that as debt to income ratio increases, its contribution to risk goes up. So you can leverage this kind of capability to verify intuition regarding monotonicity and smoothness, as well as identify weird behavior of the model. So over here is an island where very high debt to income ratio folks are being viewed as low risk because of their high debt to income ratio, which is unusual and suspicious. Then can drill down here, examine it through a lens, through a more detailed lens, and that could be because of sample selection bias or errors in labeling of data. It's a way to both build confidence that your models are reasonable, they're adhering to some expected shapes, and also zoom in on where it might have blind spots. So let me wrap up with this take kind of key challenges slide where we started off with how to explain predictions of machine learning models to getting to reason codes and the accuracy of these explanations being a central challenge. And then I've touched on a few of these topics around stability, around fairness, and a little bit on conceptual soundness. But one of the key insights is, as you start looking at these questions through the lens of explanations, suddenly for machine learning models in particular, a number of the natural ways of analyzing these models, traditional models, they carry over with some adjustments. And so there's a interesting trajectory here for model risk management teams are often very sophisticated in, and there's a rich tradition there of using rigorous methods. And then analog for that, and with small adjustments for machine learning, is now starting to emerge. And some part of it, a good chunk of it, is leveraging advances in explainability technology. That's the message I'll leave you with. There are additional takeaways more specific to the use of Shapley values in a practical setting to generate explanations, and then carrying it over to a number of these concepts for model risk assessment. With that, let me thank you for your attention, and I'll open it up for questions, comments. Over to you, Sri.
Thank you so much, Anupam. This was an excellent presentation, and there's a lot of material in it. I wish we had scheduled this as a 3-hour session so that we could kind of dive into each one of these concepts. But we'd love to hear from you more. I actually had a couple of questions just to kind of tie some of the themes we have been discussing in prior sessions. Now, what's your view on this whole debate on interpretable models versus explainable models? There's a lot of discussion on white box, black box models. So how do you see that discussion shaping up, and how do you position some of the methodologies you were mentioning in kind of context of both the financial services industry and model risk management in general?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was starting to get into that towards the end of the talk. I don't view that as a dichotomy, that these are polar opposites. In fact, they're very closely connected. So in particular, let me point out a few things. I'm starting to get into that in the discussion on stability in particular. If you think about traditional risk models, which are inherently interpretable in that there's some amount of bucketization and then it's linear beyond that, right? And so when you think about models like that, then the standard ways of assessing stability with population stability index and characteristic stability index, right? For linear models, you have that framework. It's quite well established. If you go to machine learning models, what changes now is that you can't simply that mapping between the data shift, which is captured by a characteristic stability index, and the score shift, because it's a linear model, they are all separate, and you can just kind of carry it over through a simple linear addition. Now, when you go to a more complex machine learning model, which has nonlinearities and feature interactions, some of the metrics that we have developed and the attribution methods actually and philosophically have that exact same question, which is how do you decompose, if you will, the shift in the model scores back to shifts in the data distributions. And there is a nice additive decomposition of that process at a technical level, which very closely parallels what is being done for linear models, for PSI, CSI style decomposition. And so that, in my view, is a very natural adjustment, if you will, as you go from linear risk models to more, or piecewise linear to ones where there are non-linearities. And this carries over to the bias analysis. It carries over to some of the other conceptual soundness analysis as well. The other comment I'll make here is another way in which the connection can be tight is you can view machine learning models, more complex machine learning models, let's say tree ensemble models or deep neural networks, not as the models that you put into production, but a basis for generating features that you would then put into more inherently interpretable models. So that's another intersection connection where, and we have done this now at a few major financial services companies where we're able to extract features from, let's say, a GBM model or extract features from a deep neural network. And those features are interpretable because with the explainability technology, you start getting to that point where a model race function can have confidence that this makes sense. And then those could be added to simpler model classes, to a generalized linear model or additive model, in a way that you can capture some of the non-linearities in our feature interactions in the more complex world, put it in a form that's much more interpretable, and then add it to empower or augment these simpler model classes. So I think at least my point of view here is that we should not view inherently explainable model, inherently interpretable models and more complex models that are explained once they're built as like diametrically opposite and like a contentious point, but rather there's a rich synergy between them. That in fact, the methods that are being used to explain the more complex models are doing linear decompositions and piecewise linear functions often to arrive at that view. That's one. And also they can be leveraged to extract features to increase the power of more inherently explainable models. And also philosophically, I do feel like the world is not linear. These are complex problems which require non-linearities to be captured somewhere, as well as feature interactions. And those are that's where the power is of moving, either transitioning directly to more complex models or indirectly leveraging that to generate interpretable features. This is a richer conversation, and like you mentioned Agus, and we have had some conversations on this topic as well. I think this is a topic where there's a lot of synergy between the two areas, and it's useful to recognize that and elaborate on that as we grow as a field.
Absolutely. A lot of questions coming up, and I have a couple more questions. One is, I get this question when I teach my model risk management course. Sri, you're kind of, teaching all these things and all these concepts. Now, when we try and operationalize it, I loved your data drift slide. I may probably steal it from you with your permission sometime to share it with some of my students. That when you kind of bring in this notion of, okay, so when you see the distribution of what's being realized and what we are trained for. Now, two questions actually. One, are you talking about just concepts like KL divergence and Frechet distance and things like that to identify the drift in terms of distributions? And the follow-on is, are there other metrics you would recommend? The second question is like, what happens afterwards? Like, once you identify, how do you go back and fix that in the context of, do you retrain the models, or do you do data augmentation, or do you think about synthetic data generation? Like, what are the state-of-the-art techniques you would recommend once you identify data?
Yeah, great questions. The distributional distance can be measured in different ways. And so we have done a bunch of different studies there, and there isn't necessarily one silver bullet for, it depends on the characteristics of the distribution, what metric to use. One thing that we have found useful is just as a baseline, having difference of means is a good starting point.
Mhm.
But as you go into distributions which have more complex geometry, it becomes more valuable to have geometry-aware metrics that are not just looking at means and variances, but can actually account for the shape differences in the distribution. So as you start thinking about things like Earth mover distance, for example, can get quite useful. Once you have attributed the shift back to your second question, once you attribute the shift back to specific features, what you do next depends a lot on what you find. But for example, it could be that the shifts are because of model score shifts are because of legitimate shifts. The risk scores are going up because income is going down for a certain segment of the population. If that's the finding, then that means the model is still, it could mean that the model is still stable. It's still behaving reasonably, right? And so one kind of action could be just no action because you have concluded that the shift in model scores is because of changes in data distribution, but in a way that is where the model is still behaving reasonably. Sometimes it could be because of shifts in a certain feature might have suddenly become, the model might have suddenly become very reactive to a certain feature, which you don't expect the model to be reactive to, right? Because maybe this is some kind of feature related to the most recent payment, and that has gone, a bunch of people have missed those payments, and then the model is very reactive to that. And in a world where there is some amount of need to be compassionate, major financial services might be taking a position that we will put in additional business rules to make sure that for some amount of time, there will be vacations and payment vacations and things like that. There could be, over time, if that continues, that policy might change. So sometimes the adjustment isn't in the model directly, but the surrounding business rules, right? And in some cases, if certain kinds of feature missing values and such are going up a lot, then, and it depends a lot on that feature, and the imputation isn't very reliable, then that would be a place to revisit the features. You might even drop some features for some period of time or ignore their impact. Those are some examples, but that space of interventions is quite large.
Absolutely. So we'll have one last question and we'll kind of wrap up today. And so this is a very practical thing. You know, most of our model risk managers and auditors in the financial industry, you know, they came from a traditional statistical programming, financial engineering, quantitative finance world, or MBAs, so business graduates. And now they're picking up machine learning. They are going to automatic machine learning tools, and they're kind of looking at the world and, okay, how do I augment my current processes with all these cool things which are happening, right? On the other hand, you're also seeing, you know, the field of explainability significantly increasing, and that basically means that you're having all these, you know, methodologies, and frankly, some of it requires significant amount of technical knowledge and sophistication to understand and use these tools. Now, how do you see the field evolving? Because on one hand, you know, one thought is like to hire those experts to do explanations, but the reality is model risk management teams have restricted budgets in financial industries, and they may not have the same budgets as, you know, a money-making group, which is kind of, you know, flush with data scientists who are building new investment strategies. On the other hand, you know, there's talk about algorithmic auditing, where you kind of engage third-party experts who can potentially look at these models and provide qualified opinions, like consulting companies. So how do you see the balance go in terms of, you know, I mean, ideally you want to understand your models, your data, your context really, really, really well when you deploy these models, but it also comes with implementation gaps on how do you bring that level of sophistication within a group, versus you engaging third-party engagements where you can potentially outsource some of your efforts to qualified experts who understand these technologies rather than you training your internal group. So how do you kind of solve this dilemma?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sri. A few thoughts here. One is tooling, right? So having software that is providing that higher level interface to get a higher level view into these kinds of capabilities, functions around stability, around fairness, around conceptual soundness. So in some ways, hiding a little bit of the lower level details of exactly how you're doing the analysis, but rather providing a more abstract view of what the conclusion of the analysis is and how to interpret the results. That coupled with some amount of training is like an important piece of the next step forward. And in my personal experience, when I've engaged with model risk teams, what I do find is that it's a very technically sophisticated branch. So that additional amount of education is not, that's not the barrier so long as there is enough motivation and interest organizationally to make that happen. So I do think that in some ways, the rigor that a model risk team brings into these large financial institutions and financial institutions in general is extremely important for this next phase that we are transitioning into, where complex machine learning models are moving into very high stakes. It's ubiquitous across lots of stakes, lots of different kinds of materiality levels. But even in the high materiality and medium materiality levels, there is a strong move and transition. The world is headed in that direction. And it's extremely important to have the guardrails that model risk teams provide, and for them to be equipped to carry out their functions effectively and efficiently. And so I do see this combination of tooling and education to be an important part of it. And so what you are doing is very valuable here. The other phenomena that is starting to happen is a bit of a shift left, meaning that the set of the checklist, if you will, for model evaluation that traditionally sits with model risk, as tools are starting to get used more extensively by first-line teams as well, not just for high materiality models, but across the board, some of that work needs to happen up front.
Right.
Like some of the stability analysis, the robustness analysis, the fairness analysis needs to happen during model development and is starting to happen there, right? And that's going to be extremely important for financial institutions to effectively scale, so that first-line teams in some ways need also that tooling and education, so that they do a big chunk of the work already. Otherwise, MRM teams will get slammed. Way more work than they can possibly handle. So that would be the other observation, that this shift left of phenomena where testing and evaluation needs to become part of the DNA of the first line teams as well, in addition to the second line MRM teams.
Absolutely. And I would love to continue the conversation, but it's 1:07 and we'll have to wrap up, at least in the East Coast. So Anupam, this was an absolute pleasure. I'm going to make a couple of concluding remarks before we adjourn for the day. And, Anupam and I, we are talking about a potential extended workshop in April. So please stay tuned, and we'll kind of get back to you with more details on that. So as we wrap up, I'm going to share a couple of things in the spirit of continuing the conversation. We are going to be sharing the slides which Anupam has shared with me, and it will be available on Q.Academy. Next week, we have another session in the same theme of explainability, this time focusing specifically on supervised machine learning. And we have two researchers from Germany, Dr. Marco Huber from the University of Stuttgart, and Nadia Burkhardt, who's at Fraunhofer. They're going to be leading the discussion specifically on explainability of supervised machine learning. And they wrote an amazing survey paper, and they're going to be sharing some of their research and kind of the state of the art on what's happening. So please stay tuned. And One thing to note, next week it's on February the 16th on Tuesday, not on the Wednesday. So please note your calendars on that, and you can register at qspeakerseries23.splash.com. And one last announcement, we are offering our first course in algorithmic auditing for machine learning and AI models. So we just went live with the site. It's algoauditing.splashdev.com. So it's primarily geared towards industry practitioners trying to understand what does it mean to build in that capability in-house for internal auditing. And as Anupam was mentioning, the ramp up and the extra education on how do you enable the practitioners is what we are focused on. So please stay tuned for this class, which is starting on April 1st. And also the Q Sandbox will be made available to all participants to enable you to kind of try out and check out some of the models and how you can potentially do auditing on some sample studies, and sample models will be made available. So, and as always, all the slides of the prior presentations and the videos of prior presentations are available on q.academy. So if you register, you'll get access to all the slides and the videos. So that's it for today. And it was an absolute pleasure again, Anupam, and looking forward to continuing the conversation online. And thank you all for attending today's session, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you again.
Thank you.